always ask yourself how your own culture, bias, privilege, and experiences are influencing your leadership and communication.
I'm humbled in many ways to have with us today Erin Robinson. She currently serves as the middle school principal at UWC United World College at Southeast Asia's East Campus. And she's held a variety of other leadership roles in other schools as well. And a really interesting thing about Erin is that she grew up as a third culture kid attending international schools. So she brings not only having been a leader in our schools and a teacher, but also a kid herself. And I know that every time I have a chance to speak with her, that experience plays largely into the outstanding leader that she has become today. In the past few years, we've been fortunate to have Erin teaching with us on our Leadership and Team Dynamics course. And Erin, we're really all eager to hear from you.
All right, I am unmuted. Hi, everybody. It is so good to see everybody, whether you are morning, afternoon, evening. I'm here in Singapore and am really thrilled to offer the Pearl for you today. I come at this Pearl really from my background as a third culture kid growing up in international schools, really seeing how cultures interplay with one another and the impact that that has in education, with students, with the entire community. And I also come at today's Pearl from a real streak of social justice that I have. And I think if I were to call anything my life's work, it would be this. And so I'm really happy to share with you some thinking around leadership and team dynamics, but through the lens of being a culturally responsive leader. And so I'm going to share my screen and share a few things with you. All right, so I'm going to start talking as I do this. So there are a number of pearls that we've heard up until this point, and actually in your comments themselves, things that you want to work on in terms of communication and empathy. Many people saying that they want to learn to listen more deeply, be more patient. And those are all really excellent skills to have as a leader. And sometimes we don't really think about the cultural lens that that has. And so today I am hoping that we can think a little bit more about what some of these past pearls might look like if we're using a cultural lens. So Melissa she had a fabulous pearl on people work. And we heard from a number of other pearlers around courage and empathy, vulnerability, relationships, trust. But how do you build these things in an intercultural context? Because we all come with our own biases, we all come with our own identity. And so what trust means to one culture doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in another culture. And so it's really important to be thinking through this culturally responsive lens. So the Leadership and Team Dynamics course, like all of the courses, have a set of essential questions. And so I'm going to focus today around two of them. Number 7 in the course, which is how do I know myself as a leader and how can I continuously improve? And number 4, what are the communication skills required for effective leadership? All of this within the lens of our current context, which is an absolute calling and demand for greater diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice in international schools. So if you haven't seen that going on, you haven't been paying attention because it is everywhere. Bambi and PTC have wonderful resources that are up on the website that you can check out. Thai Online has had a number of short articles and opinion papers written about it. It's pretty much everywhere. And so this will give you a little taste and reflection on your own leadership and what that might look like. So I'll start with just an excerpt from this poem from somebody named Ben Okri, and it's from an anthology called Mental Fight, and he's a Nigerian author, a bit of an activist. He's a super fascinating person. And it says, we rise or fall by the choice we make. It all depends on the road we take. And the choice and the road depend on the light we have, the light we bend, on the light we use or refuse. And the reason why I chose this is because we all have a choice. And with this call for greater DEI work, we have that choice to reflect on ourselves and also to think about how that leadership projects out into our international schools. So the first place that we want to start is that self-reflection. Who are you as an interculturally responsive leader? And as you start to think about that question, it is really important that we remember that culture permeates everything. Oftentimes we refer to it in terms of organizations, in terms of how school culture, we reference things like the Peter Drucker quote on culture eating strategy for breakfast, but you can also take that to the individual. And as Jean Moule says, culture is absolutely all-encompassing. It's like water to a fish. It's so much so that we hardly even notice that it's around us because it's just permeating everything until it's disturbed, which is what's happening now in the world. And then we say, what's going on here? Now, the thing is that we want to be a little more proactive about that and catch it before it gets to that seriously disturbed point. And one way that you can do that is thinking about it in terms of a continuum. So I'm going to share a few different models. I'm going to move through them very quickly because it's just to give you kind of a taste of things. So the cultural continuum, cultural proficiency continuum is one that's been around for a while. It's built on a continuum that goes basically from something called ethnocentric to ethno-relativism. And I put the two different colors in there so you can kind of see. So cultural destructiveness, cultural incapacity, cultural blindness. Those are behaviors, ways of thinking that really get in the way of being an interculturally responsive leader. And you might be somewhat dismissive. I think maybe historically we have been in international schools that simply because we're an international school, of course we're not doing any of those things. But I can tell you, having grown up as an international school kid, it's very much true. I grew up on oil camps in Saudi Arabia. That was definitely further down the line because we were sheltered in a bubble from the rest of the country. At that point, Saudis were not even allowed to live in the camp. It's changed since then, but that's how I grew up. Cultural blindness is something that permeates all international schools because many of us were raised to say that that was actually the right thing, that we don't see color, we treat all people the same. But in fact, that is more ethnocentric. You move down the line to cultural precompetence, cultural competence, cultural proficiency, and that's where we want to get. So you probably have heard the term anti-racist, and how can I be an anti-racist? Well, that's getting towards cultural proficiency. When you understand your own privilege, you understand that differences are really important. You honor those differences and you leverage them as strengths. We also see the same kind of continuum in the IDI work, which some of you may be familiar with in international schools, through the intercultural development continuum, similar kind of thing. It's an assessment that, that you can do to see where you're at. So that might be something that you want to look into. I love this quote because this work is ongoing. It's continual. You will always be working on it. It's us examining and reevaluating events, actions, our underlying beliefs. Why do we have things the way that we have them? And not just taking things as assumptions, but really digging into why is that the way it is? And 3 questions that Renita Mayfield in a book that was just published this year in 2020, Cultural Competence Now, she says to ask ourselves is, are my actions or those of others promoting equity or perpetuating inequity? Am I or others part of the problem or part of the solution to ending racism and privilege? And what will I do? Because we must have an action. And that's sometimes the criticism that we can draw when we get into this work, that we spend so much time in self-reflection that we actually don't have an action to go with it. So the second part of my pearl today is to think about communication. So all of you that were really interested in the communication side of things, this is for you. The first thing to think about is actually the ladder of inference. So this has been around for a long time. Argyris and Senge are sort of the ones that have used this work the most. And it basically is helping us to understand that all human thought is biased. All human thought. So you may have heard sort of a need to look into unconscious bias, implicit bias. It's because the way that our brains work is to use bias. So we see, you know, all of us on this call see the same thing, but we choose to select certain observations. We then add meaning to that based on our own experiences, our own culture. We draw conclusions from it, we adopt our beliefs, and then we jump to actions. And that's just how we work, human thought works. And there can be a reflexive loop in that, which if we're not careful, we're just allowing that bias to run over and over and over again. So what we have to do is bring a level of consciousness to say, we're not going to assume, we're going to actually question, why is it that I'm thinking that? And that's really hard work, but it's pivotal in order to have intercultural communication that's effective. Another model that's really helpful to think of in terms of intercultural communication is around cultural dimensions. So this has been around since the 80s. Gerrit Hofstede kind of coined these different dimensions, and it basically shows a polarity in various dimensions of culture. I'm not going to spend too much on him, and instead look at Erin Meyer's more recent work, which is quite similar. It's based in the same area. And it's looking through these 8 different points, and you can see the polarities there. And if you think about your own intercultural groups, and when things have not gone so well, you might look at this and be like, oh yeah, I can definitely see that. Scheduling is one that oftentimes we see in schools, because some cultures really prefer linear time and other cultures prefer flexible time. Now, if you put people together who prefer linear time and flexible time, and they don't really understand that that's the place that they're coming from, they can end up in conflict. So it's really important to understand where you sit with this, and to also think about that in terms of the people that you're working with. It can get really complicated. So if we just take communicating, and in terms of high context and low context. So some of you may be from cultures or living in countries that have very high context with communicating. Everything's quite implicit, layered, nuanced. If you're not used to it, you're not too sure what's actually being said. A low context culture is quite explicit, simple, clear, direct. So if you take the extremes, low context in the US, and in high context, you've got Japan. So if you are an American living in Japan, you have probably noticed this quite a lot, because there's such a difference. And in international schools, we've got people from all over the world. So you can see how this gets really complicated, and you need to bring a level of consciousness as a leader. This is another diagram just to show you how complicated it can be. If you've got somebody from Germany, France, China, Japan, they're going to be coming at things from all different directions. So as an interculturally responsive leader, it's navigating that. So you do have to really understand yourself very well. You also have to understand how communication works with people. In the LTD course, we talk a lot about nonverbal communication as well, which plays a huge part in all of this. If you can get to a place where you are culturally responsive, you can navigate that and leverage strengths. So this is just to say, towards sort of the end, that sometimes we think about communication as being through our ears and our eyes, but actually it's very much through our belief systems. And if we want to get to that place of being anti-racist, around being culturally proficient, we have to suspend that for some time. And it feels very, very awkward. But you have to do that before you can enter into that place of empathy and compassion and get into the dialogues that we need to get into. If there is one pearl to take into tomorrow, really think about the use of silence. This is really fascinating. So comfort with silence is going to depend on a different cultural context. You can see the example there. So an Anglo-American conversation pattern is sequential. We usually have one person talk, then another person talks, then another person talks, then another person talks. And there's very little space in between. East Asian conversation patterns will have pauses and silences in between. Latin American conversation patterns tend to overlap. And you can kind of have some amalgamation of these. If you take effective teaming and you've got people from different countries, you can actually see this happen. I saw it happen when we had a new team member come onto our leadership team who was quite used to the overlapping. And we were doing the sort of norms of collaboration, thinking collaborative, trying to pause and really allow thinking space. And it really didn't go well. And the whole team felt off kilter. And it was simply because the communication patterns had changed. It's really, really fascinating. So that is the pearl that I have to share with you. And it's just to always ask yourself how your own culture, bias, privilege, and experiences are influencing your leadership and communication.
Fantastic, Erin, really giving us so many tools. I have my old low-tech writing down, thoughts and things that we can not only bring to all of you through future courses and things, but just for myself thinking, oh, good, I'm going to have a team meeting right after this. I wonder what I can use to move into that. I wanted to ask, we do have a couple questions coming in there. Here's one. Are you ready?
Yep.
How has a third culture kid influenced student engagement, especially during the pandemic? Do you have any thoughts on, I think, how being a third culture kid? How has being a third culture kid influenced student engagement, especially during the pandemic?
Student engagement, especially, so how my perspective as a third culture kid or third culture kids in general?
So I don't know who asked the question because I'm getting it through our back channel. So let's move on to another question while we identify that, all right? How did you surface that issue on your leadership team, the example that you gave? How did you surface that on your leadership team?
Yep. Once I figured out that that was what was happening, I actually, I just went to the whiteboard that was in the room, and it's quite easy to draw out those patterns. You just do little squiggly marks. And I said, okay, so this is how it works in terms of communication patterns. What do we think is going on here? And we could all identify it right away. Once you like show that and people understand that people communicate in different kinds of ways, and comfort with silence really differs. And we identified together that we were really purposely trying to pause. And when we had a new member come in who wasn't used to that and hadn't been sort of through the same professional learning that we had, that it was off kilter.
We now know where the question came from. Thank you, Scott. I think the best thing is if we unmute Scott and let him actually ask the question. Scott?
Hi, thank you so much. This is a fantastic pearl. Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Robinson. So I was asking about, from your perspective, being a third culture kid, how has this influenced say, student engagement from your perspective and for your students at your school? And thank you so much, Director Betts.
So, yeah, I think growing up as a third culture kid is very much a part of my identity. And so I can see how when kids are growing up as third culture kid, it does really impact their engagement. And actually that was sort of my doctoral dissertation. I was looking at teacher cultural competence and student engagement and what that looked like. And essentially, if I boiled it down to a little nutshell, when students perceived their teacher to be culturally competent, whether the teacher thought they were culturally competent or not, they were highly engaged in the class. If students felt like their teacher was not culturally competent, then they were not engaged at all.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And to, you know, maybe Erin, you can point us in some direction to be able to read a little bit more about those conclusions that you've drawn. Because this is like a minute-to-minute thing that happens to us every day in the international school, and probably in most schools around the world, even if they don't have the word international in their title, because there are cultural differences of all sorts, you know. So I would like to go back to the culture map, the one for your namesake, Erin.
Yeah.
And, you know, that ladder. So, and there were like 8 or 9 things on there. And could you pick one of those that you could maybe give us an example of how that's either played out, maybe with kids, if possible, because I think much of it is, yes, for our faculties, our staff, we need to understand how to deal with each other in team meetings, etc. And we have the kids, you know, the kids who could have a diet of 12 years of culturally incompetent teachers and leaders. And, you know, that would be a bad thing. So pick one of those and give us an example.
Yeah. So I think one that comes up pretty often for students, parents, and also leaders is around leadership structures and between hierarchical and egalitarian. So oftentimes in international schools, we're trying to be more egalitarian. But if you're coming from a culture that is more hierarchical, that is very difficult to do. And so sometimes for students and even for staff members, what this can look like is not sharing your voice and then being criticized for it. Like, you should share your voice more. You should share your voice. But actually, if they're coming from a hierarchical background, that would be highly offensive. And so it's a very awkward. You're asking people to come really very, very, very far out of their comfort zone instead of using a bit more flex and coming down a little bit from that egalitarian kind of perspective. It can also happen quite a lot. So those of you that are leader and that are working with administrative support, you can oftentimes see that rub happen there as well in terms of the hierarchical, but we act egalitarian. And so you have to really learn how to navigate between those two. And with all of these, nothing's good or bad. But sometimes we view it that way. Sometimes we view egalitarian as the good one, hierarchical is the bad one, but that's not, we can't use that frame. It's sort of neutral in that regard. And it's about learning to flex and navigate between the two.